The 1970s brought us legends like Bowie, Queen, and Fleetwood Mac, but many incredible bands flew under the radar. Today, we're uncovering hidden gems of 70s rock, groups with groundbreaking music that faded into obscurity. Let's dive into their stories and why they deserved more. The band that should have been bigger, but never quite made it during their time. Formed in Memphis in 1971, they were led by Alex Chilton, the former teen idol from the Box Tops, and Chris Bell, a perfectionist and musical visionary. Along with Andy Hummel on bass and Jody Stevens on drums, they created a sound that was ahead of its time. Big Star's debut album, #1 record in 1972, is now a power pop classic, but it didn't achieve commercial success at the time. Their follow-up, Radio City in 1974, featured their most famous song, September Girls, now revered as one of the best power pop anthems ever. But despite their brilliance, Big Star struggled with internal tensions and a lack of promotional support. Bell left after Radio City, and Big Star disbanded shortly after. Their albums didn't make a big impact when they were released, and they never had a mainstream hit. However, Big Star's legacy has grown exponentially since then. While they weren't famous in their time, their music has influenced countless bands like R.E.M. and The Replacements. Today, Big Star is considered one of the most influential rock bands of all time, and their story is one of unfulfilled potential, made all the more poignant by Bell's untimely death in 1978. That should have been one of the giants of the 1970s heavy metal scene, but never quite achieved the fame they deserved. Formed in 1967 in Cardiff, Wales, Budgie was known for their heavy, riff-driven sound, blending hard rock, heavy metal, and prog. The band was made up of Burke Shelley on vocals and bass, Tony Bourge on guitar, and Ray Phillips on drums. Their self-titled debut album in 1971 showcased their heavy, distorted sound. The band followed that up with Squawk in 1972 and Never Turn Your Back on a Friend in 1973, which featured their most famous song, Bread Fan. Despite their critical acclaim and a dedicated following, Budgie's commercial success never reached the heights it should have. They were overshadowed by bigger names like Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. Today, Budgie is remembered as one of the most underrated heavy metal pioneers of the 1970s. While they never received the recognition they deserved, their legacy lives on in rock and metal. Audience, a British progressive rock band from the early 1970s, never quite made the splash they deserved. Formed in 1969, they blended rock, jazz, and classical elements, led by Howard Worth on vocals and guitar. Along with Keith Gemmell on saxophone and flute, Tony Connor on drums, and John Fisher on bass, the band brought a refreshing mix of complexity and melody to the progressive rock scene. Their second album, The House on the Hill in 1971, featured their most famous song, Jackdaw. Blending prog with emotional intensity. Despite critical praise, audiences' music never caught on with a broader audience. Their style was too experimental for the average rock listener and too accessible for die-hard prog fans, leaving them in limbo. The band split up in 1972 after their final album, Audience in the Street, received limited attention. Today, Audience is remembered fondly by a small but dedicated fan base, with their albums now considered hidden gems of the 1970s progressive rock scene. Crack the Sky, a band that fused rock, prog, and everything in between, slipped under the radar of mainstream success. Formed in 1973 in Weirton, West Virginia, Crack the Skye was led by John Palumbo, with Jim Griffiths, Joe Macker, Rick Witkowski, and Vinnie D'Andrea rounding out the lineup. They were destined for greatness, but didn't get the break they deserved. Their self-titled debut album in 1975 was an ambitious mix of progressive rock, art rock, and dark lyrics. The album was full of intricate instrumentation and catchy melodies, with tracks like Ice. Despite critical acclaim, the album didn't chart, and the band struggled to find a wider audience. They released several more albums in the late 70s and 80s, but never broke through to the mainstream. Today, Crack the Skye remains a cult classic, with bands like Weezer and Barenaked Ladies citing them as an influence. Though they never reached the fame they deserved, their innovative approach continues to inspire. A groundbreaking all-female rock band from the early 1970s, was ahead of its time, but never received the recognition it deserved. Formed in 1969 in Los Angeles, Fanny was led by sisters John and June Millington, with Alice DeBoer and Nikki Barclay completing the lineup. Fanny's debut album in 1970 introduced their unique sound, blending tight rock with soulful undertones. Their second album, Fanny Hill in 1972, is considered their finest work. Despite praise from critics and fans like David Bowie, Fanny struggled to break into the mainstream. The rock industry was still dominated by male bands, and Fanny was often dismissed due to their gender. By the mid-70s, the band went through lineup changes and disbanded in 1974. Today, Fanny is celebrated as one of the most influential all-female rock bands in history, inspiring many musicians who recognize their immense talent. Starz, a band that embodied the glam rock and hard rock spirit of the 1970s, never got the fame they deserved. Formed in 1973 in New York City, Starz was led by Mitch Weissman, with Tommy Starr, Joe X, Doob, Richie Rano, and Peter Snake, Sisk, rounding out the lineup. Their debut album in 1976 showcased their infectious energy with tracks like Detroit Girls and Move On. Their follow-up, Violation in 1977, continued their hard-edged rock style with tracks like Cherry Baby. However, despite praise, they never broke through to a larger mainstream audience. Their inconsistent image and lack of a strong push from their label kept them from becoming stars. The band faded by the late 70s, but their influence lives on. Neu, the groundbreaking German band from Dusseldorf, helped shape experimental rock, yet remained relatively unknown during their time. Formed in 1971, Neu was part of the krautrock movement and consisted of Michael Rother and Klaus Dinger. Their debut album in 1972 introduced the Motorik beat, a steady, repetitive rhythm that influenced genres like post-punk, techno, and industrial rock. Despite their innovative music, Neu never achieved commercial success. Their experimental approach and unconventional sounds made them too avant-garde for mainstream audiences. They disbanded in 1975, but remain one of the most influential acts in rock history, with artists like David Bowie and Brian Eno citing them as inspirations. Gentle Giant, a British progressive rock band from 1970, was one of the most technically skilled bands of the 70s, but never reached the commercial success they deserved. Known for their virtuosic musicianship and complex arrangements, Gentle Giant was led by the Shulman brothers, Kerry, Phil, Derek, Ray, and Gary Green. Their 1971 album Acquiring the Taste marked the beginning of their distinctive sound, blending rock, jazz, classical, and even medieval influences. Despite their critical acclaim, they were too complex for mainstream rock fans. By the late 1970s, their popularity waned, and the band disbanded in 1980. However, their influence is still felt today, with Gentle Giant being regarded as one of the most ambitious prog bands in history. B-Bop Deluxe, led by Bill Nelson, blended glam rock, progressive rock, and jazz in a unique mix, but never got the recognition they deserved. Formed in 1974, their debut album Axe Victim in 1974 showcased sharp guitar riffs and quirky songwriting. Their most commercially successful album, Sunburst Finish in 1976, featured tracks like Ships in the Night, but the band remained largely overlooked compared to other glam rock acts. Despite critical praise, B-Bop Deluxe never reached mainstream success. Their unique blend of genres and eclectic style made it hard for them to solidify a clear identity. The band disbanded in 1979, but Bill Nelson's influence on art rock and new wave music continued. The Raspberries, another iconic 1970s band that never quite reached the level of mainstream recognition they deserved. Formed in 1970 in Cleveland, Ohio, the Raspberries were a key player in the power pop movement, known for their infectious melodies and harmonies, as well as their nod to classic 1960s pop and rock influences. They are perhaps best known for songs like Go All the Way and I Wanna Be With You. Despite critical acclaim, the Raspberries struggled with finding lasting commercial success. Their debut album in 1972, The Raspberries, was well received, but it wasn't until their second album, Fresh, in 1972, that they really started to make waves with songs like Go All the Way. The band had a knack for blending Beatle-esque melodies with more rock-driven instrumentation, earning them comparisons to groups like the Beatles, the Byrds, and Badfinger. However, their style, which bridged pop and rock, didn't quite fit neatly into the musical trends of the early 70s, which may have contributed to their lack of a massive following at the time. The Raspberries went through several lineup changes, but despite their impressive sound and talented musicianship, they were often overshadowed by bigger names. Their final album, Starting Over in 1974, was a commercial disappointment, leading to their breakup later that same year. And there you have it, a look at some of the most underrated rock bands of the 1970s. While the big names ruled the charts, these bands were creating groundbreaking music that still influences artists today. What do you think? Did we miss any? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay updated. Until next time, keep the music alive.